This is the On Humans podcast, a show which makes new research about humanity more accessible to everyone and more meaningful to the big questions about our self-understanding. I'm your host, Ilari Mäkelä, and today's conversation continues this September's journey deep into the human brain. We've heard from two experts on the story and the origins of the brain, but today we focus on the present. We focus on what we have. We focus on trying, despite all the mysteries and despite all the complex Latin terminologies, we try to get a little bit more intimate with the grey, wrinkly matter that we all carry in our skulls, and that, by whatever magic, orchestrate our very conscious experience. My guest is Pria Anand. She is an American neurologist and author who recently published her first book, Mind Electric, on the subject matter of today. And so in this episode, we're going to discuss different brain areas and different brain waves. What can they tell us about our experience from sleep to suffering and from memory to the art of storytelling. We're also going to discuss some of the most mind-bending studies in the whole of neuroscience, which raise the question of could our very consciousness be split into two, with two concerts of consciousness playing at the same time within the same head? So there's a lot in here, but Anand is a very engaging speaker and writer, and her explanations are remarkably easy to follow. I listen to a lot of brain science stuff, and even with a degree on the matter, I often get lost. I hope you don't get lost in this one. If you do check the show notes, there are some little pointers there, as well as references and a quick fact-checking section, as I will have from here on in all episodes. If you find any factual mistakes in this or any other episodes, let me know, and I will do my best to add them to each section's fact-check box from now on. But without further ado, let's get this episode started. As always, if you like this and you're new to the show, do subscribe. If you are a returning listener and want to show a little bit of support, the easiest thing you can do is find a way to give the show a nice review on whatever podcast app you're using, and share it to friends or family or colleagues. And before we get started, just as always, one final brief thank you to all the wonderful people who support me at patreon.com/onhumans, making this work possible and all the more rewarding. So thank you so much. And as always, this episode is for you. Now let's go. Dr. Pria Anand, welcome to On Humans.
Thank you so much for having me.
And congrats on your new book, Mind Electric. Did it take a long time to write?
So I have been thinking about a lot of the stuff in the book for decades. You can ask any of my students, but I have two toddlers, and I actually wrote the first couple of chapters right after I gave birth to my first child. And then I wrote the entire book while I was on maternity leave with my second baby. So it was really a kind of sleepless, manic writing frenzy.
Actually, sleep is
Yes.
one of the things I could not stop thinking about having read the book.
It's interesting. I think a lot about sleep. I spent time in medical training, so I would work like every fourth day. I would work like a 30-hour shift, and became really fixated on sleep. I find it so fascinating. And then when I was pregnant and after I had a child, I started thinking a lot more about sleep again. Like I never had dreams before I became pregnant.
Oh, really?
And it's so fascinating to think about sort of like the time that we spend in REM sleep and why. So I don't recommend having toddlers for good sleep, but it's been very interesting to think about.
Well, nor taking the medical
Yes.
medical career, it turns out. I was shocked that you guys actually work 30-hour shifts. Why, by the way? I don't necessarily want to be treated by a doctor who has been up for 36 hours.
Yeah, it's very interesting. So, I mean, I think if you would ask doctors now, there are sort of two camps. There are people who say like what we do is stupid and barbaric and it's bad for patients and it's bad for doctors. And then there are people who say that there's some value in having the same person take care of you for 30 hours. So someone watch you, the course of your illness evolve over 30 hours. So there are people who say that a lot of the mistakes in medicine happen during handoff. So at the moment where one doctor passes a case to another doctor, that's when information gets lost. And there are a lot of people who also say that there's a value in those long hours for trainees, where this idea that like watching someone come in and not look very sick, and then certain kinds of illnesses can progress very rapidly, and sort of watching that full 30-hour progression or watching someone over the course of 2 days can tell you something about how an illness works, so that the next time you see it, you'll have a better sense of how it evolves. But it's really interesting. I spent some time when I was writing this book trying to understand the provenance of that training model. And the origin story of medical residencies in the United States dates back to two physicians. One was a surgeon, William Halsted, and he famously would work at like 6 different hospitals at the same time, and he would operate day and night. And all of the idea, he made this training model in his own image. And he said, these to prove that you are like firm enough of spirit. You have to be able to work these hours. And years after he died, we learned that he actually had been a cocaine addict the whole time, and
Oh, well, that
that was why
explains.
he was able to function without sleep. And yet we still do the same thing. So, anyways, it's interesting. I have a lot of thoughts about this. I really believe that those call shifts are really something valuable for me. But I think there's also this like labor politics element to medical training where in the United States and I think in many places, residents or physicians who are in training are like a cheap labor source, and hospitals are incentivized to have as few of them working as many hours as possible. And I think there's a risk in like lionizing that idea of staying awake for a long time being a really like important virtue of doctors, because I think there are a lot of people who could benefit from from that without actually believing that it helps patients or doctors.
Yeah, well, let's talk about sleep and the brain. So there's so many ways kind of into the brain. We can talk about brain areas. I think we will talk about brain areas later. But then there is also the kind of less architectural and maybe more musical side of brain studies, which is all about brain waves, EEGs, brain oscillations. If we look at what happens in this more musical side of things, what do we know? What does happen when we sleep or when we are in different kinds of sleep?
That's such a lovely way to put it. Yeah, exactly. I think the brain is this like this physical mass, and then it's also sort of its function. So all of these things that you cannot see on a static brain MRI, but don't tell us anything about how it's functioning. So it's a really sort of I think the evolution of our thinking on sleep is really fascinating in the sense that I think for many years science thought of sleep as just sort of like a total cessation of normal waking activity. So it was like you're awake and all of these interesting physiologic things happen and then you're asleep and that's it. And we understand now is that sleep is this remarkably active moment in the kind of musicality of our brain. So what the really like beautiful example of this is rapid eye movement sleep. So REM sleep, the sleep where you experience dreams that you often remember when you wake up. Um, the sort of earliest observations of the first moment we start to think about REM sleep as being as this kind of distinct moment of sleep. It was described as paradoxical sleep because a person would be still, but their EEG would look for all the world like they were awake. And beneath their eyelids, their eyes would be flickering.
The body is at rest, but the mind is very active.
Not even that the body is at rest, the body is paralyzed. So during REM sleep, every muscle in your body, except for your diaphragm and your extraocular muscles, so the muscles that control your eye movements, every other muscle in your body is paralyzed. And there are consequences to that. So people who suffer from sleep apnea, it often gets a lot worse during REM sleep because the accessory muscles that help them to breathe otherwise are totally paralyzed. There are people, one of the earliest signs of Parkinson's disease and certain kinds of dementias is that people will lose that REM atonia. So they will become extremely active in their sleep. They'll punch and kick and act out their dreams during REM sleep because they lose that paralysis. And on the flip side, in people who are struggling with narcolepsy, where you can be awake but have that paralysis. So I love the term paradoxical sleep, which is an old one we don't use anymore. But I think that the scientists who coined it were very wise because it is not just it's this profound stillness of your body. You're physically paralyzed as if you had received like a paralytic anesthetic, but your brain is seems to be perceiving things or is having the experience of perception while you're paralyzed and asleep.
Any speculations on why? What's the point? What's the function? What's the origin of this paradoxical sleep, this REM sleep, where we have dreams and our bodies are paralyzed as we run through the fields of our minds?
It's such a great question. I think if you asked like 50 different neuroscientists, they would tell you 50 different things about what
Okay,
the
I
why is
see.
advantageous. I mean, I mean, I will say like REM sleep is so costly. So there's some discussion of sort of like primates who sleep in trees versus primates who sleep on the ground, right? Primates who sleep in trees have much shorter and much more fragmented periods of REM sleep because you cannot be paralyzed for prolonged periods of time. There's this idea that like there are a lot of things that we might have given up in order to be able to have longer periods of REM sleep. So there must be some value to it.
So, what's your favorite hypothesis? Your favorite guess?
I think my favorite idea about REM sleep is the notion that REM sleep is a way to forget experiences that are no longer necessary. So the idea that REM sleep is an important part of like pruning what our brains choose to retain and focus on. there's so many things that are totally inscrutable about the brain, but one is how this massive connections, how meaning can emerge from this massive connections. And I think a big part of finding meaning is eliminating things that don't have meaning. I love the idea that that's something that happens during REM sleep, is that we like are learning to make meaning from everything we perceived by re-experiencing some of those sensations and choosing which ones to allow to kind of ebb away out of our synapses.
Before we move away from sleep, let's do the opposite side. I mean, when people interested in biohacking or sleep
Yeah.
analysis, they often look at not only how many hours I slept, but also how much REM sleep I got and how much deep sleep I got. And deep sleep seems to be right. That's the almost the exact opposite. So the brain waves, they don't look anything like the waking brain as they do in REM sleep when we're in deep sleep. What do they look like, and what does that tell us?
So the term we use is slow. We often use the term slow wave sleep, which like describes the musicality of that phase of sleep. I mean, it's really interesting, but I think like a really universal truth about brains and about neurology is a lot of what we understand about the brain comes from moments where we get to see it not working. So there are medications that that shift the amount of time that your brain spends in REM versus slow wave sleep. Slow wave sleep is where parasomnia is like kids who sleepwalk or have night terrors, but then wake up and have no memory of having this. These are all like really dramatic external things, but we know so little about the phenomenology of slow wave sleep because unlike in REM sleep where you can wake someone up when they go into REM sleep and ask them about their dreams, slow wave sleep is a little bit different. It doesn't seem to sort of have things that are retained in our conscious perception when someone is awoken.
And when we call it slow wave, that's not a metaphor, right? That it's literally, if you look at the electrical signals in the brain, you map them as a wave. These are slow, very long wavelength waves.
Yes, right, exactly. So when we're mapping these, so the old way of doing it was literally like a stylus on a piece of paper that was mapping these waves like a seismograph, the way that you would map like earthquake activity. And so we do it in a slightly more sophisticated manner now, but the same thing is like you're looking at the frequency of those oscillations um, and how they change.
And they get fancy names like the alpha waves and the theta waves or whatever. And,
Yes, right.
well, if the slowest wavelengths, if we try to understand what these different fancy names would mean, I mean, the slowest waves would be something that's associated with deep sleep. Um, am I right that one of the things that would be associated with the opposite, which is very rapid, kind of spiky, very fast turbulence in these waves, would be seizures, for example, in epilepsy?
Yes, sharp is a word that we often use to describe seizures, but I think like a more sort of universal way to describe seizures is that they have this. I love the way you described brainwaves as music as having a musicality. So I think seizures have like a rhythmicity. So they evolve in frequency, they evolve in location, and they evolve in time. So seizures describe an abnormal synchronous firing of a population of neurons either that is often quite rhythmic and either kind of becomes faster or spreads to involve a larger area of the brain. So it has kind of consequences beyond that initial population of neurons that is firing together.
It's quite interesting actually because it's very intuitive, and I've heard many people say this, and this is half of the truth, is that there is a way in which consciousness is associated with integration. Like, things get integrated, different signals get integrated in consciousness. But there is also the other side of the truth is, right, that you don't want the whole brain to get suddenly kind of integrated playing the same tune. That a conscious, awake, healthy brain is having different things going on. And in seizures, for example, I've heard it explained to me once as kind of you have this small part of the brain that starts to play a tune, and that tune suddenly goes everywhere. And you don't want that, this kind of ultra synchronization across the brain. First of all, do you think that's a decent explanation that I've heard and now paraphrasing? And if so, what do you think that tells us about the non-seizure healthy brain states?
So I think there's like a poetry to that explanation that I really like. I guess the one issue that I would take with it is that I think we have this vision of seizures. The vision that we have of seizures is of generalized seizures. So seizures that do involve the whole brain and that are manifest with shakings because your entire brain is firing synchronously. But seizures actually come in many different kinds of flavors. And some seizures are just a strange perceptual experience. So someone might have a strange perceptual experience and not manifest anything in their body.
What would that look like? What would that feel like?
So Sometimes people will experience something like deja vu, so the sensation that you have seen or felt something before, even if it's totally novel. People will describe a phantom smell, and that can be the full extent of a very focal localized seizure. Some people will hear like the chords of a song, always the same one because it's the same group of cells that are firing.
Yes, I remember in your book you described you had a patient who always had a Van Halen song playing.
The Van Halen song, I guess. Yeah.
But where's the difference between, me having an earworm and having a deja vu and this becoming an epileptic seizure that you would be treating me with at the hospital?
Oh, so the patient that you're mentioning actually didn't come to the hospital until a generalized tonic-clonic seizure. So had been having the same 4 chords of the same Van Halen song kind of in episodes and sometimes in clusters and never thought anything of it.
So do I get it right that, for example, your patient, she had localized seizures in the brain? So one rhythm, one song, whatever's in the brain waves in one area started spreading in, but locally. And she didn't think much of it. She was, oh, I just have this earworm.
Yes.
Maybe a very strong earworm, not enough to go to the hospital. But then this was actually epilepsy. And this did then later give her this kind of, what Julius Caesar and, Fyodor Dostoevsky and so many famous people throughout
Yeah.
history have had, which is when you start trembling and, maybe there's stuff, foam coming from your mouth. And that's when she seek treatment. And what you found was that it's interesting that it wasn't just like no epilepsy, sudden epilepsy, but actually there were these signs. Does it mean that we should be worried if we get a lot of earworms? We might be epileptic. At what point do we come to see you if we start having, these deja vus, earworms, these kind of things? Because we all have some of them.
Yes, of course. What's so interesting about seizures is that I think they tell us something about like normal phenomenology, right? Like deja vu or these earworms, like these are part of the normal human experience. The things that always like prickle my antennae and make me think about seizures are they extremely stereotyped? So is it always like the exact same 4 chords at the exact same frequency, and is it the same sequence of events? So like the music always happens in the exact same order because our brains are much more flexible than that when they're firing the way that they are made to. And I'll just say Dostoevsky gives like the most beautiful descriptions of focal seizures. So he is like if you read his letters, he describes like the moment before someone has a generalized seizure. And he describes this like ecstatic aura where people feel this sort of tremendous moment of profound joy and elation. And I think it gets back to your earlier point about this idea of like synchronization being something that's like valuable in the brain.
I think that, epilepsy is not only fascinating because of epilepsy itself, but because of all the somewhat troubling, somewhat puzzling, very mysterious things that have happened when we tried to cure epilepsy. And one of the most striking things is that because the big seizures, they spread across the brain, well, a pretty natural idea of the 60s or 70s was then, okay, well, if we split the left and the right half of the brain apart, and the seizures can go from the left to the right, it's just remarkable what can happen.
Yeah. So I have a couple of thoughts about this. So the first is the calosotomy, as you're describing it, sort of severing the hemispheres of the brain. It's interesting. I sent a draft of this to a friend of mine who's a pediatric neurologist, and he was like, "My big correction is that you talk about calosotomy as in the past tense, but it's still something actually when kids on 6 medications that are not controlling their seizures and they're having storms of seizures every day. He's like, it's still something that I talk to my patients about." So he corrected me that I should not have that entire section in the past tense. But in the world of adult neurology, it's interesting. I actually was in the clinic last week and saw a patient who 2 years earlier had a ruptured aneurysm of his anterior cerebral arteries.
Okay, that's a very technical term. Let's make sure we're on the same page. So, this was not an operation done to the patient. This was an accident that happened to some blood carrying pipes in the brain.
Yes, exactly. Yeah. So some of the pipes that carry blood to parts of his brain, essentially, because of all kinds of things that can injure the blood vessels, like having high blood pressure. So there's like blood coursing through at a very high pressure. A little balloon formed in the wall of that artery, and the balloon got kind of bigger. And as it stretched, like just the way when you overinflate a balloon, the rubber is getting thinner and thinner and thinner, and then it finally burst. And so we had bleeding in his brain, and that bleeding actually injured his anterior corpus callosum.
And corpus callosum is the bridge between the left and the right.
Exactly, the bridge between the left and the right hemispheres. And so this had happened 2 years earlier, and I had gotten a call from the doctor who had treated as aneurysm. And she said, he's having these bizarre symptoms. I don't know what's going on. Can you see him? And he described this really, he was describing that he felt like he was not in control of his left hand. So he said, like, sometimes that means I want my left hand to do something and it doesn't do it. Sometimes that means I'm opening a jar with my right hand and my left hand is closing it. I'm tucking in a shirt with my right hand, my left hand is untucking it. I'm holding an object in my left hand and I don't realize I'm holding it until it falls from my hand. So it's very interesting. He had a surgery to correct the bleeding, and much of his brain was intact. But the thing that was not intact was the ability of the two halves of his brain to communicate with one another. And I think, uh, this has raised as many questions, I think, as it's answered. But we see this. I mean, there's other really fascinating examples. So I've seen someone who had a stroke of the of a of the corpus callosum, so that bridge at the back part of his brain, and developed this really interesting phenomenon where he could see. So visual information that was coming in, he had a stroke that involved kind of the left visual cortex at the back of his brain and the bridge between his left and right brain at the back. And visual information would come in from the left side of the world, go into the right half of his brain, but it couldn't travel to the left half of his brain to be processed as language.
Because the left brain is the language processor.
Yes, and arguably everyone has some left dominant language function. So it's this, you can develop these disconnection syndromes where, because half of our brain is more eloquent than the other half, half of our brain can be operating totally outside of our conscious control, in people who have had this kind of callosotomy, so severing of the halves of their brain. And that doesn't just happen because of a surgery. It can happen because of a stroke or a tumor or any other number of things that can make it difficult for information to get between the hemispheres of the brain.
Yeah, I mean, what is really striking about when I recall some of the classic examples, it really wasn't just about inability to speak what
Mhm.
you saw on half of the world was unspeakable. And it wasn't just one arm doing one thing and the other arm doing another thing. I mean, that's pretty funky already. And um, but there was really, I think, do I remember this right? I think this was from Michael Gazzaniga's famous work. There was one person who they asked with language, spoken language, what do you want to do when you grow up? And if I remember right, the answer was an architect. And then they found a way, because that's the left hemispheres, that's the left brain speaking. But they found a way to kind of ask the same question from the right hemisphere. I think they flashed it as a question, written question, and that was, the right brain was able to process it. And then they gave like Scrabble pieces for the right brain's hand, so the left hand, to write the answer with. And the answer was something completely different. I think it was a race car driver or something. So there was
Yeah.
like this two like completely, there were two people. There is the kind of intuitive conclusion. And there's so many similar examples. And so what do you think? Like, what's going on? Are there like two people in some sense within? One of them controls the mouth and a lot of language, so they get a lot of airtime, and the other one is a little bit hidden. Or is that going too far?
It's interesting. So those experiments by Michael Gazzaniga is so fascinating. He like makes use of this really helpful quirk of our brains, which is that visual information also is lateralized. So visual information lands either in your right or left hemisphere. So you can tell half of the brain something without telling the other half of the brain the same information. And what was so fascinating is that the left half of your brain like really wants to be involved, no matter what the task is, or no matter what you're doing. So information would be shown to the other half of a brain, like someone would be told, someone's right half of their brain would be told to draw a smiling face, and the person would draw a smiling face, and then they would be asked, why did you draw a smiling face? Like, why didn't you draw a different kind of face? And the left half of the brain would come up with an answer even though it had not received the instructions. The left brain would say, what did you want me to do, draw a crying face? Like, so it's really fascinating because there is this constant sort of like this desire to narrativize
Yeah.
and to justify. There's there, it's sort of like this like motivated reasoning that our left half of the brain is constantly doing. So I don't know that it's interesting. I think there are like many different Well, there are many different sort of loci of consciousness, and there are many different places that someone can be wounded that can affect their consciousness. But I think um, the hazard of our brain are so particular and so different, and it's fascinating to me because I tell my residents and my students that the thing that is like the scariest to me is someone could have a massive stroke on the left side of the brain and you will know immediately. Like, they won't be speaking or they'll have all kinds of really interesting language problems, and we can talk about what those look like. But someone can have a massive stroke of the right hemisphere of the brain, and you might not, if you don't know sort of what to look for, you might not realize it because people they'll develop what's called apraxia. So they will lose their ability to do sort of learned motor routines. But unless you know that that's the problem, they can just look confused. They'll develop hemi-neglect, hemispatial neglect. So they will stop attending to either the left half of their body or the left half of their world, but will be completely unaware of the information that's missing. And then you were describing sort of the term is an alien hand or an anarchic hand. And the great example is like Dr. Strangelove is like the classic example of this idea of a hand doing something beyond your control. And sometimes really complicated things. So I was telling you about this patient who was opening and closing jars. One hand was trying to open them, the other hand was trying to close them. People will say, like, I was trying to steer the car to the right, and the left hand was trying to steer it to the left. It's like they developed like really oppositional behaviors. And it's so interesting because I don't know how much of it is a second consciousness or a second person, and how much of it is like the oppositional part. So how much of it is this sort of like primitive reflex that's entire purpose is to act in opposition to the other hand, versus how much of it is sort of rooted in consciousness. And it's so hard to probe. I think it's so hard to probe because I think like, we rely so much on like verbal report.
Yeah, exactly. And I think that one of the big questions there is how much is this a quirk that happens in these very particular cases of damage or epileptic treatment versus is this kind of, I think the thing that some people disagree with Michael Gazzaniga, who is the kind of grand old man on this field, is the question of how much does it tell us about us all? Because I think he sees that this is a kind of, here we see in clear contrasts what is happening always inside us, which is one part of the brain does something and then another part of the brain explains and finds a good story for it. And there's always this inner conflicts going on. But there is another way of reading this, which is that this is just a quirky situation that emerges when you do severe this deep integration that we normally have. Most people don't do one thing with the left hand and another thing on the right hand because obviously most people have an integrated brain with the bridge intact. So where do you land on that? Like, how much do you think that these split brain situations bring to clear contrast something that's already there, which is that our brains are not one thing, but there's kind of different voices within us, versus how much are they a peculiar situation that is exactly interesting because it is so different from what you and I would experience with our full integrated brains?
I think my general philosophy is that peculiar situations tell us something about healthy brains. Like, I think that's true very universally. And I think what they tell us, you can argue about. So, like, I do think that those split brain experiments tell us a lot about brains that are whole. Um, and I think if there are a few things that I think you can take from those experiments and actually see in many, many different kinds of disease processes, so much so that I feel like they are a universal truth.
What would be an example?
So for instance, I mean, you sort of described that the left half of the brain is telling a story to explain what's happening or to try and like make sense of the world, and that's true not just in patients who have a split brain and are trying to explain why their left hand is doing something weird, but also in people who have amnesia. So in the hospital where I practice, I sometimes see people who have a consequence of chronic alcohol use called Korsakoff's dementia. So they'll develop this really profound amnesia. They won't remember that they're sick. They won't remember they're in the hospital. They'll lose a lot of information about their own life story, and they'll invent these stories to make up for the information they lost.
What kind of stories?
Very detailed stories. They can be stories that make sense, or they can be stories that are totally outlandish. So my favorite question to ask someone who is struggling with their memory is, have we met before? Like, do you know me? And I'll get stories like, we were childhood sweethearts. We met at our high school reunion. I had a patient who had like a skull fracture, and he was wearing he's wearing a helmet because he had a skull fracture to keep from further injuring his brain. And he told me he was wearing the helmet again, I'm in America. He told me wearing the helmet because he's going to play in the big football game. Really like very detailed stories that any writer I think would envy that our brains construct and that people have like are fully unaware that they're doing it. And I don't think that's because they're two different people living inside our skulls or that they're like different that we have multiple different consciousnesses. I think one of the things that split brain experiments tell us and that these patients who can what's called confabulate, which is without realizing it, make up these stories, tell us is it just tells us something about how we echoes a little bit what we spoke about earlier, this idea of like what is this salience of dreams? Or like why do we have REM sleep? Why did we make this big sacrifice to be able to have REM sleep? And part of it I think is just like we are consciousness like perception is so chaotic and we have to know what to kind of attend to or what is salient or what matters. And I think part of that is with this kind of like constant narrativizing. So I think that's a part of many I think that is such a universal feature of many different kinds of illness, not just split brain patients, that I think that does tell us something about how our brains work when they're whole.
And what it tells us is that we are good storytellers.
Oh, we're really good we're good storytellers. That's sort of a human superpower, but it's also maybe like a human liability, I would say.
Yes, yes, yes. Well, let's keep working through the architecture then. I mean, with the architecture, the most obvious distinction is the left and the right. But then there's also the top and the bottom. Here things get a bit murky because there's many ways to cut the cake. I think of this often as it's a bit similar than the Americas. You can talk of North America versus South America. You can talk of North America, Central America, South America, or Latin America. It gets very messy when you're in the middle. And in the same way, is it that we have cortex, subcortex brainstem? Is it that we have neocortex, limbic system brainstem? I mean, there's many ways to cut the cake, but clearly there's this area which, in one formulation we call the limbic system, that whole place in between what is. We haven't talked about cerebellum yet. Cerebellum is at the back. That's weird. Let's get to that. but there's a clear way in which at the very top you have the neocortex and some other parts that we're called cortex. Cortex means the bark, right? Like the bark of the tree in Latin. I mean, it's
The
just
rind, right?
yeah, just that kind of wrinkly stuff. And then the brainstem controls the heartbeat, whatever. Very important to stay alive, but not often in these discussions. But limbic system comes up all the time, or subcortex. This bit comes up all the time as this kind of something really interesting is going on in here. And this is kind of the negotiating the higher and the lower parts of the brain. It's like in between them. And here we also have epileptic treatments. All right, there is the famous case of parts of the limbic system being just taken off to cure epilepsy. Was it what was the patient's name? Is it Henry Molaison? Is that
Right. Yes. Yeah. HM as we knew him for the longest time. But yeah.
yeah? Well, I mean, it wasn't the whole of the limbic system, but it was a big part of his limbic system was just taken off, right? Just cut out.
Well, right. So the problem was the part of the brain that's sort of the most seizurogenic is the mesial temporal lobes, and that is a bulk of the like where a lot of the limbic system lives, and it's also where some of the structures that help us to form memories or encode memories live. And I think the problem in his case was it's still a surgery that we do, so we still do anterior temporal lobectomies, but in his case it was bilateral, so he had it done to both of his temporal lobes and not just one, and they took part of both of his temporal lobes.
And so the idea here would be back to the Van Halen song example is that a patient of yours used to have these very localized small problems first, which turned out to, as the experience of a Van Halen song later, they became globalized. If you would just take that little bit of the brain out where the Van Halen song started playing, you would not get the problem.
Exactly. Yes. Yeah.
And in this case with the patient HM, 50s, 60s, I think 50s, right? Long time ago. They took a decent chunk of the limbic system from left and right. And what happened to him?
Yeah, it's this really interesting story. So he had these intractable seizures that began when he was a kid. He'd had this car accident. It's not clear if that was kind of the provenance of his seizures. And he had this surgery where some of the structures where memories are formed, we now understand, were removed. And he developed this profound, mostly anterograde amnesia. So like when you see movies that talk about amnesia, people are often shown as forgetting their life up until that moment. But often actually in neurology, the kind of amnesia people have is exactly the opposite. So there's some things that they retain from their prior life, but they lose the ability to form new memories.
Yeah, so instead of waking up and having no idea where you are, you know exactly where you are, but you can't form new memories.
Or you might not know exactly where you are, but you might have very clear memories of like who you were. You might have very clear memories of your childhood home, your parents, all of those details of your life, but be unable to form new
Interesting.
memories. And
Because
so,
I've actually had a very short experience. Let's get back to the story, but just to share. I mean, I once hit my head. I fainted. I'm relatively tall, and my blood pressure isn't terribly high. So a couple of times in my life, it has happened that I just faint. And one of the times, it proved somewhat troubling because I hit my head, and I had this kind of movie amnesia. I woke up. I had no idea. My girlfriend was there. My ex-girlfriend. I was like, "Who are you?" I have no idea who she was. I had no idea where I was, and it took me only a couple of minutes to start kind of piecing the word back. And I remember the moment when I realized that I'm Finnish, and that like that was like, okay, I'm getting back into reality. Um, but so it's interesting now that you say that, because yeah, I've actually not only seen it in films but also experienced for a very short period of time. This was not a serious amnesia. There's nothing I think I lost during, but it just took me a while to be back in the world of my memories, and I really had no idea who I was, what my name was when I woke up. Um, so how? By the way, so does it happen? So you say that that's typically this movie pattern that I've also briefly experienced. You say that that's not typically what happens with amnesia. That's not what happened with HM. Is that sometimes the case?
there's something called transient global amnesia, which is like there are so many things in medicine that we name and still like don't understand, and understand
Yeah.
embarrassingly little about.
The three Latin names with an acronym does not mean that it's understood.
Yeah, right, exactly. Like, oh yeah, we have an eponym for it. But it's really, I mean, it's when you see it, really profound. So people will have this experience of profound amnesia, and that they will have this like it's like broken record speech where they'll ask again and again, "Where am I? Who am I? What happened?" And just have no information. And then at some point over the course of hours, things just come back.
Yes, yes. So that was what happened to me. But what happened with HM was significantly more troubling, because I've seen him write his diary in a documentary, and it was quite striking because he starts writing it, and then soon he's like, "What is this text?" Like he kind of like, it takes like a minute or two for the person writing not to feel like the same person who started that page, and then he got quite frustrated. In other times, he was not frustrated at all about this. He was very loving towards his wife, right, and played music and things like that. But he couldn't say that this is my wife. He just like had a kind of natural reaction to be like, "Oh, hey." At least that's what I remember from the documentary I saw.
Well, that's a really interesting point. So, so you're absolutely right. Like he developed a sense of familiarity with, for instance, these researchers. He had this sense that they were familiar to him, even though he could not explicitly say who they were or why he knew them. And so that also speaks. It's like another moment where like we understand something about how the brain works from what happens when it's wounded. So this familiarity exists a little bit separately from explicit memory. I think deja vu is an example of that disconnect of the sense of familiarity without an explicit reason to have it.
Yes, yes. But but by the way, we don't need to spend too much time on this, but briefly, I'm pretty sure that he did not remember who his wife was, but the wife was his wife before the surgery.
Surgery.
So he did lose some of the recent memories also, not just the incapacity to code new memories.
I think the childhood memories were the ones that were sort of many of them were ones um, that were much more deeply encoded.
Yeah, and this was especially the hippocampus was the part of the limbic system, right, that he lost, which is also, I mean, Alzheimer's doesn't look similar. It's not exactly the same. It's not like you still remember your childhood home very well, but you can't code new memories. But there's some similarities, and there's also damage to hippocampus, right, in Alzheimer's. How much do you think? I mean, how much is this a kind of a surgically induced Alzheimer's versus a completely different thing? Uh, how much do we even understand Alzheimer's to be able to say?
Yeah. I mean, I think with all this like new wave of medications, it's like highlighting how little we understand the pathophysiology of Alzheimer's. Alzheimer's is really interesting because I feel like there are two different, in any question in neurology, I feel like there are two different questions you have to ask. And the question people always want to ask is what is happening? But I feel like the question you have to always ask first is where is it happening? And Alzheimer's actually, so there are a few different types of Alzheimer's. Alzheimer's can manifest in different ways depending on what parts of the brain are involved earliest. So the most common example is like this sort of amnestic variant where people have profound temporal atrophy.
So the same areas that we've been discussing this. Yeah.
Exactly, yeah. And the childhood memories tend to, like, people will lose their recent and intermediate term memory, but have, sometimes their childhood memories will last sort of for longer. But there are also variants. There's something called posterior cortical atrophy, which is like a back of the brain, the visual structures. So they'll develop a form of they'll they can have visual hallucinations or a form of profound kind of blindness before they start to have memory problems. There are people who will manifest with an aphasia first, so they'll have language problems before they develop memory problems. So it depends on where.
Yeah.
Before it depends on why.
I see. I see. Okay. Um, on this bit, the limbic system, I guess, would be the easiest way to call this whole middle part. It's not just memories. Um, you have a very interesting discussion on pain and pain versus suffering. And how that, why don't we do that? What are the two kinds of pains, or what's the difference between pain and suffering from a neurologist's point of view?
It's such an interesting question. So when you think about pain, like when you think about what happens when you touch a hot stove, there's like there's the physical apparatus of pain, which are these small unmyelinated nerve fibers that are carrying the signal about that change. But when we talk about pain, we talk about it as like an aversive experience. Like pain has a
Yeah.
valence. It is like a bad thing. It's not just that you experienced vibration or you experienced something that had a particular temperature. It is aversive, and we experience it in our brains, not just in our skin and in our nerves. So pain doesn't just reach our somatosensory cortex. It doesn't reach our thalamus. It's actually processed within our limbic system. So it's processed by the same part of our brain that processes fear and elation and all of the emotions you can experience.
And importantly, I think you can pick those apart. I guess the medical example would be ibuprofen or like a local anesthetic, which prevents the sensation from leaving the skin to the brain. And then opioids would be one way of trying to reduce the suffering part. So many people, I mean, I remember when I had surgery and I was on opioids after that, it wasn't that I didn't feel the pain, but it just felt less unpleasant. I would laugh about the pain, which is a bit, it's a bit schematic. I mean, it's a bit simplified. But first of all, do you think that the kind of local anesthetic versus opioids, or ibuprofen versus opioids, does that work as a way to probe that distinction? And if not, what would be a better way?
I think opioids are complicated and messy. And I think a better example might be like dissociative anesthetics. So some of the anesthetic drugs that we use for surgery don't actually numb you, but they make you not care about the things you're experiencing. As you said, you can get like lidocaine, and lidocaine is something that you'll inject at a place that you want to numb, and you can poke a needle into it, and someone will be able to experience that.
That's kind of what I want when I go to a surgery.
Yes,
If
yes,
someone is like, "You'll feel all the cuts,
yeah.
but you won't care," I'll be like, "No, no, 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 give me something else." But interesting. So it does. So the alternative does exist. What would be an example of that? I mean, it's a fancy Latin word probably, but well,
We call them like dissociative anesthetics.
dissociative anesthetic.
Is like
Interesting. I didn't know
the
about
broad
them. Yeah.
category. Yeah.
Okay. But when would you use them? Because like I said, I don't want to feel. Just give me the traditional stuff where I don't feel anything.
Well, often when you're having a procedure or surgery, you actually get multiple different kinds. And
I see. So you do get a cocktail.
right, exactly. You get something, you'll get a paralytic as well. And if you just got the paralytic, you would feel everything.
Interesting. Okay.
I mean, it's similar to, I mean, this is a horrible, and feel free to cut this out. But, like when it like in the barbaric United States where there's still the death penalty, you get multiple injections because you don't want to just give someone a paralytic and have them still be experiencing pain. Like, so you're taking away someone's ability to physically respond, their sensation, and then also this kind of like other like brain part of it.
I see. I see. I see. Well, into happier topics, the reason I I care about and I'm fascinated by the distinction is that it has a long philosophical tradition, especially in India, of making the distinction between pain and suffering. Buddha has this famous analogy of life is full of. Buddha says many things about suffering. Uh, Sometimes it gets very metaphysical, but sometimes it's very, very psychological. And one of the, I think, the most well-known kind of parables that he has is the parable of the two arrows, where he says that life is full of suffering, bad things happen, tough luck. But what we do with the typical workings of our mind is that we don't just let one arrow hit us, but then we take the arrow and then we hit us again as a second arrow. And that second arrow is us not just feeling the tingles, the pressure, the heat, but also being, oh, that's bad, feeling aversion. And this is not just philosophy now, there's actually quite a lot of meditation science which have very, very decent results showing that this is what happens with experienced meditators. That experienced meditators can feel the pain sensation just as strongly, sometimes even stronger than lay people. But they might have a much, and their brain imaging studies suggesting that in the limbic system where we know that this kind of aversion, this suffering bit kicks in, the second arrow, that can be very dampened quite a lot. And I find that whole literature very fascinating. Have you paid attention? Is that something that you've paid attention at all? Do you have anything to comment on that side of the issue?
Yeah, it's really interesting actually. So there are all kinds of things that can make you experience like that, like valence piece of pain. So for instance, like anticipation of pain, the idea of flinching when you expect to get burned, you could have all of the same affective response.
And those are dampened, in these meditation studies often. I remember seeing these graphs where the aversive response starts like a long time before the actual electric shock is given
Yes.
to the participant, except in the master meditators where there is no before, there is no after. It's just the moment. They do feel it, but they don't care that much. And I do find those fascinating.
It's interesting. I think a lot about pain. I like witness a lot of pain, I think, in the course of my practice. The thing about pain is that it's not just physical and it's not just medical, it's like cultural too. Like I think, you know, a universal example would be something like childbirth, which is this experience that is is a universal experience that is like culturally cast in different ways depending on how people think that we should experience the physical sensations of childbirth. Or like another example would be like a lot of cultural initiation rituals involve pain, right? So like if you join the military here, it's like, there's a maxim in the Marine Corps that's like pain is weakness leaving the body. Like you're supposed to experience. But it's interesting to me because I think we like moralize around pain and how people manifest pain or how people experience pain so much more than we do than like around any other neurologic function or physical symptom. And so it's just really fascinating to me because I think pain is so cultural as much as it is physical.
I think that's a good place to start approaching the close, but I won't let you go quite yet. I mentioned earlier that there is the neocortex, limbic system, and then there's the brain stem, and there's the cerebellum. Very mysterious. I had Susanna Herculana Hosel on years ago, and I reposted that episode recently. And she has done a lot of research on cerebellums in elephants, which turn out to have the most majestically oversized cerebellum in the animal world, it turns out. But one thing that came up in that conversation is how little we actually do understand about the cerebellum. And that's something that you also in your book, you venture into cerebellum, you talk about it, but it does seem to be a little bit of a misty area, at least. In the neocortex, we have so many different Latin names of this part and that part. And the cerebellum I always hear about it talked of just like, well, is that thing there? And it does something. So what do you think? How mysterious is the cerebellum? And is there anything we can really say besides the fact that it's a bit of a mysterious place in the brain?
And I could talk for a whole episode about the cerebellum. I can't wait to hear about the cerebella of elephants, which are I'm not very familiar with them. So I'm going to be so excited to listen to that though. My kids are very interested in elephants. So yeah, cerebellum is fascinating. And again, because I'm a physician, I think about things when they're broken. And so I've had the luxury of seeing sort of many different ways that things can go right at the cerebellum. I think the cerebellum is fascinating for so many reasons. So one is just as an observer, so cerebellum means sort of small brain, and it's this small brain that sits beneath our brain that wraps around the brainstem, and it looks so different from the rest of our brain. So the rest of our brain is sort of this like, crumpled sheet of paper, wrinkly kind of folds of cortex, and the cerebellum is really sort of exquisite. So it has these leaves of folia. It looks so much more beautifully organized, I think, than the rest of the brain. It has this kind of
Okay.
accordion-like structure that I think is lovely, and it sits at this like critical nexus between your brain and your body. But the cerebellum, I think we're starting to understand, has like a logic and an organization that's all its own. And I think there's this mistake of imagining that the cerebellum, because of where it sits, sort of at the junction of the brain and the spinal cord, there is this. We make the mistake of imagining that the cerebellum is purely a structure that modulates movement. And we So I can give you examples from my own practices of other things. So for instance, like when someone has an injury to their cerebellum, depending on where the injury is, you can see not just the movements of their eyes, the movements of their limbs, the way that they walk, the the kind of the their ability to kind of correct themselves or maintain kind of an upright stature as they walk. The coordination of their voice. So people who have cerebellar lesions will often have a voice where you can't quite pinpoint what's wrong with it. It sounds like the slurring of someone who's drunk, but it's some of the syllables are too fast and some of them are too slow. And the cadence and the tempo of your voice is not being regulated, just like your movements are not being regulated.
Interesting.
But there is also this really interesting sort of more recent, and when I say more recent, like I mean in the last 30 years, literature around the cerebellar kind of the ways that the cerebellum checks not only our movements, but also it also is a part of emotional regulation and is a part of cognitive regulation in a similar way. This idea of it like maintaining some form of equilibrium, of not just a movement, but of all of these other things. I don't know if that's true in elephants as well, but is I think something adding to the mistiness.
Yeah. I mean, the long story short with the elephants is almost that, like you said, there's something about coordination of complex movements that the cerebellum is associated with, and where the elephant has the trunk, which is a hugely complicated organ because it doesn't have joints. And so you can move it in any shape or form to any angle in any way. It's kind of infinite possibilities for the trunk. And yeah, that's in some sense that resonates with what you said. But I stand by what I said. I think it's a very misty area.
Misty, yes, that's a good word for it. Yes.
Okay, well, I think that's a good place to start coming to a close. So as always, my last question is, how has all your work shaped your outlook on humanity?
It's a great question. I have listened to other of your guests give really wise answers. I think I think what I would say is that I sort of came into the practice of medicine imagining that there were a lot of sort of like very clear definitions or buckets or binaries that I just hadn't learned yet that would define kind of bodies and illness and cognition and I think I the longer that I've done this, the clearer it is to me that there's a tremendous amount of gray area. There's a tremendous amount of mistiness that governs our bodies and our brains. And so I think there's a real value to sort of people like you who are curious in all of the right ways to try and kind of excavate some of that mistiness.
Well, Pria Anand, thank you so much for those words and for all your work and your time today.
Thank you so much for having me. It's been a pleasure.
Okay, so that was it for today. Thank you for sticking with us until the very end. Now, I must admit that there is one thing we did not discuss. You might have noticed. We did not discuss serotonin, dopamine, neurotransmitters, etc. in the brain. There will be a full episode on that aspect of the brain in a couple of weeks. But before that, tune in next time to a conversation with a neuroscientist and a historian of science, Matthew Cobb, who will tell the millennia-long story of the brain trying to understand itself, posing the question, can we ever really do it? To stay tuned, subscribe to the show. And to support the show, you can rate it, you can share it, and of course you can directly support it at patreon.com/onhumans. Thanks for considering. And until next time, take care.